90% of African countries are set to miss their September target of vaccinating 1 in 10 of their population. The World Health Organization says the continent of 1.3 billion people needs an extra 225 million doses to meet that mark. That's about 3.5 months away. The global vaccine sharing scheme COVAX so far distributing 81 million doses across the world. Africa, though, still acutely short. South Africa is the worst affected. Almost 2 million infections and under 1% of its population fully vaccinated. Let's go to Johannesburg and speak to Laura Lopez Gonzalez. Laura, so we're now 18 months into this pandemic. Finally, the world's richest nations are stepping up. But it's not all coming immediately. So what will the reaction be of African leaders who have been talking for so long about the need for vaccines in their countries?
Right, yeah, I think it's worth putting this in context for viewers. So vaccine experts I've spoken to said that before COVID-19, the world on average produced about 4.3 billion doses of vaccines every year. By September, before any vaccines had gone to market, the G7 countries largely had secured the bulk of that production. So the developing countries were really on the back foot. By April, for instance, you've seen the U.S. vaccinated 10 times as many people as the entirety of Africa. Less than 1% of Africans are fully vaccinated today. So for perspective, the UK's contribution alone, about 100 million doses, not all of which will go to Africa, could triple vaccine coverage on the continent. But I do think you're going to see people saying that this is delayed, this is welcomed, but it's also not immediate, and it's not immediate and quick enough to help countries like South Africa who are going through their third or second waves right now.
Yeah, okay, so we fully understand that donations on their own are not going to make up for the shortfall. Countries are also going to have to spend their own money. So we had a few months ago South Africa buying the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, and it ended up that South Africa, for those doses, for that batch, paid a lot more than some of the European nations. And the argument from the manufacturers was, well, those European nations actually put money into the research, so they got a discount. But when it comes to spending money, there are other ideas around, like the IMF, for example, the International Monetary Fund, could be loosening its restrictions on how it lends money to developing nations. But how will they be able to afford it? Because if they're borrowing money, they're still going to have to pay that money back to the IMF.
Right, I think that's a great point. And I think it's also worth pointing out when what we've kind of heard here is that, you know, the pharmaceutical companies will say, well, the U.S. put a lot of money down for something like Moderna, for instance, but, you know, African countries didn't. But those clinical trials were conducted in South Africa, which means that you're sort of using millions of dollars of infrastructure that the government has funded over the years to do those trials. So I think it's a little disingenuous sometimes when pharmaceutical companies say, listen, you haven't contributed anything. I think you're right. I think African countries find themselves in a precarious financial position. Many of the economies in Southern Africa are commodity dependent. They've seen those prices decrease during COVID-19. They've had to fund the COVID-19 outbreak response, pulling from health budgets that were very low to begin with, or definitely not what most people would want them to see in terms of health spending. So I think that these are all very pertinent questions. You know, like your previous correspondent said, I think the proof will be in the pudding about how to build that economy back more fairly, because right now I think a lot of experts are predicting that global inequality will increase after COVID-19.
Apart from the country you're speaking to us from, which other African nations are struggling at this particular moment?
So we know that in Uganda, the ICU capacity is struggling to keep up. The World Health Organization has said in Africa that they're seeing resurgences across countries, and we are definitely seeing excess deaths. So these are obviously difficult to track, and there's a capacity issue with tracking deaths. But in South Africa, we know that since May last year, we've seen almost an extra 200,000 deaths, and that's likely attributed to COVID-19.
Laura, thank you so much indeed. Laura Lopez Gonzalez speaking to us from Johannesburg. The United Nations says famine has arrived in northern Ethiopia. It's warning the situation in the region of Tigray is going to worsen, even if there are increased deliveries of humanitarian assistance. More than 3